Hello, everyone. Welcome to our partner training webcast series. And I'm Steve Walsh, and I'm the product manager for the Notes Migrator for SharePoint product at Quest. We're going to be focusing on session 5 today, which is migrating application design. So this is distinct from what we've been talking about previously, which is migrating content. We've talked a lot about migrating various types of content, and now we're going to switch gears and talk about design migration. We're first going to do an overview of what can and can't be migrated easily. The tools help with certain parts, as you'll see, and doesn't do other parts. So there are parts for design migration you might have to do manually. So we'll look into that, and we'll to kind of review what we've already talked about migrating note schema, all the field types and so on. That's sort of part of content migration, but it's definitely part of design migration as well, because that's the fundamental part of your design that you're moving over is all the schema fields and so on. We'll review that and look at some of the more advanced things. And then we're going to look at InfoPath. And there's two kinds of InfoPath forms we want to take a look at. InfoPath list forms is new with SharePoint 2010, and that's where your data is in a simple list in SharePoint, but you're using an InfoPath form to view it and edit it. So a nice new thing in SharePoint 2010. And then we have our classic InfoPath form libraries, where you have a document library and all your documents are these XML documents. That's the high-end InfoPath scenario still, where you're using the full InfoPath features and you're editing these XML data documents. So our tools can migrate your notes form design over to both of those things. We have a couple new features with version 6.1. We're migrating notes views over to SharePoint views, and then we're also provisioning content types. So similar to the way we took a notes schema and generated a custom list with the same schema, we're now doing the same thing with content types. So what can the tools do? The tools can do several things with design migration. Not surprisingly, these are the things we're going to be covering in today's talk. We do the schema migration. We do a really good job of taking a custom notes database and figure out what is the schema in here anyway. Do you want to look at it in terms of what forms are there and what fields are on those forms? Or do you want to look at it in terms of sample data items to look at what actual data items are in the data documents? This is a powerful, important thing to do. Notes databases do not have schema built into them, so you really need a good tool to help you kind of do some detective work and look in the database and figure out what should the schema be for my SharePoint site. And so our tool is going to help you with that. We do it for lists, and now we do it for content types as well. We talked about migrating forms and views. And there's a number of small little things that we do around the content migration. So in some of the previous sessions, for example, we talked about migrating approval status. So if your application has some way of representing approval status, we can migrate that over to the way SharePoint does approval status. And the same thing with workflow state. Or if you have choice fields or managed metadata fields, we can migrate all the list of valid choices or the list of managed metadata. And so these are cases where it's really content migration, but we're upgrading the schema of your SharePoint list, the valid choices in your choice field, and so forth. So this is sometimes considered part of design migration as well. Now, important to think about what the tool cannot do for you. So we've been focusing on design migration, probably for the last year, and we're still working on it. So there are things that our tool can't do, and quite frankly, no other tool can really do either. Um, One of the first ones is to use SharePoint Designer forms, and that is where we're designing ASPX forms that you can edit in SharePoint Designer, that has the same look and feel as your notes form. So that's something we don't do. There are a lot of good reasons to use SharePoint Designer to customize your forms, but it is a manual job. You would have to manually rebuild that form in SharePoint Designer. Now, you know, uh, to reference a different Quest product, there's a set of Quest web parts for SharePoint, which is a separate product that if you're going down the path of building SharePoint Designer forms, which many of our partners and consultants do, uh, the Quest web parts can certainly help with that. But that's a topic for a different session. Um, if you want to migrate the workflow logic and code, that's a case where you would have to do that manually. You're really switching here from the way Notes does workflow and code. Basically, they're writing agents and button code and form events and other kinds of code. over to what we have in SharePoint, which is more declarative workflow, where you have a rules table in SharePoint Designer usually. So it becomes much less of a code based thing and much more of a declarative thing where you're just defining the rules for your workflow and so on. And so that's a case where you'd have to do that manually. Other things like the navigation area. So if your Notes application is using outline controls or navigation controls, to build menus that are dynamic and things like that, that's a kind of case where you'd have to rebuild that yourself in SharePoint as well. And you typically would do that again in SharePoint Designer. You design menus on those ASPX forms, or you might put a custom web part that's a navigation web part. Again, Quest Web Parts has things that will help you kind of rebuild that kind of fancy navigation if you have that in your application. And then any web design elements, if you have pages, web pages or X pages in your Notes application, there are no tools that I know of that can migrate that kind of stuff. But it kind of makes sense if you think about it. These web-based components, these are different beasts than what you have in SharePoint, and you really are going to be not just migrating that page, but you're going to kind of be thinking about how the web application is working from scratch here as you're redeveloping that stuff. So most people understand why this stuff doesn't work. It'll be nice when we have SharePoint Designer forms generated for you, for sure. This other stuff, you really are not going to expect the tools to do that, and people understand that. But you need to take that into account when you plan out your migration work. You can't press a button and just get another app out the other side. So let's talk about some of the schema migration parts. So I showed you lots of examples of provisioning SharePoint columns as you're doing a migration. Column settings for a new list or a new library would be defined in the target data definition of your migration job. And most importantly, you got the name and the type of column. Is it a text column or is it a number column? Is it multi-valued and so on? And then some more interesting things like, is this a read-only column? And that's actually something that is not exposed in the standard SharePoint user interface. You can't just create a column in the web browser and say, I want it to be read-only. That's something you can do if you're a developer using Visual Studio, or now with our tool, we allow you to say, I want this to be a read-only column, and we'll provision it as a read-only column in SharePoint for you. So that's a kind of a powerful feature that you can't even do with standard SharePoint. Other properties that you see when you're provisioning columns that some of these things are now things we added in version 6.1, such as the flag that says this is a required column, or your data validation formulas. These are things that we now do new in version 6.1 of our tool, which, like I said, is in beta currently. And standard things like, do you want to add this new column to all your views or add it to all the existing content types? Also very useful things. And then here's an interesting one. This is not something that's familiar to SharePoint developers, the isTitle column property. When you're migrating an application, you're typically going to be starting with a custom list or a basic library template and then adding new stuff to that. And the custom list by default has one column, and that's the title column. Well, let's say you don't have a title column in your application. You don't necessarily want something called title in your new SharePoint list. You could actually rename that title column to something else. So a good example of that would be if you were to take a contact list template, the last name column would actually be the title column renamed to last name. And the title column has special properties. The title column is the thing that's highlighted in your view that you can click on. And so you typically want to pick one of the columns in your new list and say that one should be the main column that I click on to open the document. And if it's not called title, then you need to rename the title column to something else. And so our tool does that for you. If you just set is title column to true on one of your columns, we'll take the existing title column, rename it to whatever this new thing is you're migrating to. I showed some examples of this in session 3, I believe, of this series. And again, we have options for auto-populating terms and choices with the actual data that we encounter in your notes document. So if you have a choice field and you're not allowing fill-in choices, then you need to populate the schema of that choice field with all the valid choices. And so when we migrate thousands of documents, we will automatically upgrade the schema to capture all the choices we find along the way. So a powerful part of column provisioning. Now, once you defined all these things in your target data definition, we will provision the columns when you run your migration job. And we may be provisioning a new list. And as we talked about before, this new list could be based on an existing list template or some custom template that you have. If you've developed a custom template, we first provision the list with whatever template you specify, and then we add the new columns. So we can add new columns into new lists or new columns into existing lists. Now, one important thing to note is that we do not upgrade columns. So if you run your migration job once and then go back and say, oh, I want to change that one to be from a text field to a choice field, we're not going to go upgrade that field for you on the second pass. You actually have to go into the SharePoint list, delete the column, and then we'll reprovision it as a new column on the existing list. So important thing that some people miss. One other thing you need to know is that there's one column type that we can't provision for you. We just don't have enough stuff in our tool yet to do provisioning of managed metadata columns. So this is a case where you would need to create the list and then manually go into the list and define your managed metadata columns, and then you can continue migrating to that with a migration job. Okay, so how do you populate all these target columns in your target data definition? Well, you can do it one at a time. You can just manually define, I want this field, it's going to be a choice field, or you can use this powerful button, copy from source, and what we'll do is we'll take the entire schema that you've already defined in your source data definition, basically the fields that you've extracted out of notes, plus any computed fields you've added to that, and so on. And then we'll just provision that, we'll clone that entire note schema in SharePoint. We will take every field you identified and we'll create the equivalent SharePoint field for you in the target data definition. So this is a really quick way to extract a schema out of notes and then say I want the exact same schema in SharePoint. Now we do rename or reconfigure things as needed. And so if you have characters in the notes names that are not legal characters in SharePoint, we'll rename things properly. We'll make sure you avoid duplicates. So for example, you can't use ID as a name for a column in SharePoint. That's a reserved name. So we will rename that for you to Notes ID just to uniquify it for you. And you can further rename that yourself. You can go in and you can change the names of columns after we copied it. You can configure things and you can say instead of a text field, I want to make this be a choice field and so on. Now as we do this, we remember where things came from. So we have an auto map names property, so we can remember the column mapping. So even though you renamed a column or you reconfigured it, we'll remember the original notes column that it came from, and this is what enables that auto map button where we automatically have all the column mappings in place. Now the other way you can go is you can load in your target data definition from an existing SharePoint list. So this is really helpful if you've already got a list that you like. Let's say you're migrating to some template that already exists. Maybe your developer has built this fancy custom list which has all the fields you want, and maybe they've renamed things. They decided to do it differently than how you had it in notes, and so they've come up with new column names. You can load that schema from the SharePoint list into our migration job, and then you would just manually map one to the other. And you can kind of mix and match that. You could load from a SharePoint list, you can add additional columns to that, and then you can specify the default mappings if you want that auto map function to work. I'm going to share out my desktop now. This is a notes application that I'm going to be using for all of our demos today, and this is a real-world application. In fact, it's one that I used in the past. This is the tool that the development team used for tracking various feature requests and bugs and whatever in various products back when I was with Proposition Software, and that's the company that ultimately got acquired by Quest and produced this tool, Notes Migrator for SharePoint. So back in the old days, this used to be called Portal Migrator. So we can see a bunch of bugs that were tracked back here. We're talking back 2006 roughly, and feature requests and so on, enhancement requests. If I open this, I can see that we have a nice looking form here. Not too complicated, but a few different things in here. We have very common type of notes form. We have a little graphical layout with an icon. We have a bunch of keyword fields for the product, the type of report, the area, and so on. And who's it assigned to. Simple little thing, nothing too fancy. Very simple workflow. This just tracking the status of the bug. And we have a internal description, that's the body field, which is a big rich text area. And then we have a public description. So this is where if we wanted to produce release notes, we'd put the public as another rich text field here. And then we have our history area. So this is what we're going to be migrating, and I'm going to be using this for all of our demos today. Now let's go attempt to migrate this. So I'm going to be working mostly in the SharePoint Designer client. And let's start a new migration job and select that database. Okay, and now I will create a source data definition from it. And remember, the source data definition is how we're querying the data out of notes. So for my record selection, I'm going to migrate based on forms used. And I'll just select that report form. And by the way, if I was in version 6.0 in the shipping product, I wouldn't have a by forms used, but I could just put in a formula. I could say form equals report. So that's the current way to do it. And if you're using the beta, you can use this new feature to select by forms used. It's basically the same thing. On my data fields tab, I'm going to say select items and columns, and I'm just going to grab all the fields on the report form. Or if I wanted to, I could look at the sampled items and look at all the items on that individual data document and grab the fields I want there. But I'll do it this way for this demo. So I've defined a bunch of fields, and I've showed you this kind of demo before, so I'll try to keep it quick. We've now defined a query out of notes, which has a bunch of fields on it. And now I go to my SharePoint tab. Let's do the migration of that schema over to a new SharePoint custom list. So let's select my site. And I want to do a new custom list. So I'm going to say Proposion Development Tracking 1. That'll be my first demo. Proposion Development Tracking 1 will be this new list I'm going to create. And I'll say I do want to create it and add it to the quick launch area. And then I want to create a target data definition, which will describe the schema of this list. So I can specify the base template that I want to use. We have a list type which kind of controls some of our processing. So unless it's a document library, discussion thread, or calendar, you're going to just say other list. And then I can leave this blank. I'll just get a custom list. If I had a list template that I wanted, I could select, and we'll pick out of our SharePoint site, all the custom lists that might be already defined on that SharePoint site. But I'm just going to leave this blank, and I'm going to get a custom list. So on my data fields tab, I'm going to say load from source fields, and this is that magic button that I told you about. Basically what this does is this takes the schema of our notes query, and we basically generated a new schema for our SharePoint list. And so now I can play with this. In this case, I actually want the title field, so I don't have to think about renaming that. I'm going to put that at the top. Now the order is important here. The order will control the order we provision the columns in SharePoint, and that will be the order you see the columns in your default form. When you open it, you see the list of columns in this particular order. So I want to do that. I want to put the body to the bottom, and also take that public body, that's the external description field, and I'll actually rename that. The public body field I'm going to actually rename to public description. And for the assign to, I'm going to rename that to assign to with a space. The attachments area I'll put down at the bottom as well. And we're not going to need a folder column for this list schema, so I'll remove that. And this ID field, this is one of those cases where it was called ID in Notes, but ID is a reserved word in SharePoint, so we just generated this one. I'm going to rename that to record ID. I'm going to put that at the top. Also, project is going to be basically the product name or the sub module, and let's make that one be a choice field. So here's a case where I want to change the defaults. Instead of a text field, I want it to be a choice field. And I'm going to say add missing choice is true. That means all the project instant values that we find we're going to add to the schema of this choice field. Let's do another one. Let's put the status up there as well near the top, and that's also going to be a choice field. And we're also going to add all the missing choices. This one I actually want to use radio buttons, so let's change that to say use radio buttons. So here we have all these fields that control the provisioning of the new fields. I can say it's a required field. I can say it supports multiple values. Only certain SharePoint field types allow multiple values, as we talked about in previous sessions, but choice fields is one where I could say I want this to be multi-valued. Is it read-only? Do I want to add this to all content types? And so on. And then we have our data validation area where I could put in a validation formula and a validation message. So I'm not going to bother doing all that right now. The auto maps names, the notes status field is going to automatically map over to this field. So if I go back to record ID, I can see that even though the field is record ID, we remembered that it maps from the notes field called ID. So this will enable that auto map button to work. I guess I want to do one other thing. I want to take this record ID field and I want to say add to all views. Same with the project ID. Same with the status field. And I'll even do the area that way. Okay, well I could keep going here. Hopefully you get the point that this is a good opportunity to kind of pretty this up. Notes applications, the field names are not very user-friendly sometimes, the internal field names, and so you might want to think about how to reorder this, think about what you want to be a choice field versus a lookup field or so on, and instead of notes type, record type. And I also want this to be a choice field. And add the missing choices. And add it to all views. Okay. A couple things to keep in mind in the Advanced tab. We're going to come back later and talk about migrating notes views. This checkbox here is something that I often forget myself, and I want to remind people about it. It's in 6.0, it's on the first tab, but it's the same thing. It says that I want to migrate attachment icons as image files. So if you like to have the original notes icon showing in your rich text fields, check this box. And then we're going to migrate all the icons as well. And of course, that's a little bit more expensive. We're actually putting little icon files in your documents. But if you want that, it looks nice and it makes your end users happy because it looks like it did in Notes. So you might want to check that box. Okay. So now I've done that, I can go to my Map Data tab and I can press my Auto Map button, and then all those fields auto map. So it remembers, like I said, that ID is the field that resulted in record ID. So we kept that auto map association and so on. So this should be good enough. Well, let's just go ahead and run this job. So we're coming along, we're migrating lots of documents. And while this is running, I can probably just go to my list right now and see some of the results. Okay, so we have created a bunch of documents. We've taken these documents, we've added to the view. Remember, I checked that box that said add to all views. So there was only one view in this list so far, but we've populated automatically with these fields. And let's open one of these up here. Well, you can see we've migrated this document, and more important, we're talking about design migration here. We migrated the schema of the application according to my rules. So my project field, I said I wanted to be a choice field, and sure enough, I've populated it with all the legal choices that we had in the application itself. Same with record type, and same with status, although status I decided I wanted to use radio buttons instead of a drop-down list. So we provided these two big rich text areas, and so on. So that's kind of the first line of design migration. We migrate the schema, and really one of the conversations we always like to have with our customers, and we encourage our partners to have the same conversation with the customers, is think about when this is good enough. So sometimes you're going to say, well, I'm willing to switch over to the way SharePoint would display a form by default. Maybe this is good enough. Maybe if we get the schema right with all the settings, you don't need to do much more, other than maybe go and turn on the approval process or something like that. The question is, when is this form going to be good enough? Now, sometimes you're going to want to capture the original look and feel of your form. Remember, the original form looked like this, with this nice pretty layout. And so that's when you start to think about form migration, which is our next topic. Okay, so we're going to talk about migrating notes forms to InfoPath forms. And like I said, there's two different scenarios here, one for list forms and one for the document forms, the XML form library forms. So first, let's talk about generating list forms. Now, list forms are for SharePoint 2010 only, and they're only for people that are running InfoPath form services. And the reason is list forms are always web forms, so you need InfoPath form services to render these in the browser. Now, the workflow for list forms is you would always migrate the schema first, like I did. You don't have to migrate data documents necessarily, but you do need to provision the list with all the right columns. And so, just like I just showed you. So then you can go into SharePoint and ask SharePoint to generate an InfoPath form template for you. In InfoPath, you just press the Customize Form button, and then SharePoint will generate a starter InfoPath form template, and you just save that to disk. Now, it's important that SharePoint do this first step because the data schema of your list is bound into that InfoPath form. And so then you can run the Notes Migrator for SharePoint form migration wizard. And what that does is it takes the design of your notes form and adds that into this starter InfoPath form that you just saved to disk. And we utilize all the mappings in the migration job to figure out what field maps to what. So we not only lay out the design properly, but we enable some of the field mappings. And then from InfoPath, you can publish this to your list. So that's actually a pretty simple workflow. Now, when you're running this migration wizard, there are a number of steps to this wizard which give you options as to how you want things to be migrated. So of course you're going to be selecting which form you want to migrate from. And if this form actually had computed subforms in it, we don't give up on you. We ask you which subform would you like to insert here. InfoPath does not have a concept of subforms, so if it's a static form, subform in your notes form, we'll just automatically include that in the generated InfoPath form. But if it's a computed subform, we'll ask you if you want to pick a notes subform to include in your generated form. So it won't be a dynamic subform anymore, but at least you can pick one and insert it. And if you really need multiple subforms, you might actually generate multiple forms now where you used subforms in the past. You can specify the elements that you want to be migrated. So a notes form often has multiple controls. Some controls will show in read mode, other controls will show in edit mode. Some controls will show if you're displaying to a notes client versus a web browser. And some controls have hide when logic on it. They only display based on, the the assigned to name is a manager or whatever, things like that. You can set some high-level checkboxes that kind of tell you which of these elements you want. Do you want the edit mode, notes, and so on. And then you also have an option to create info path sections around certain elements based on how they were organized in notes. So the most common case here is if you have an element with hide when logic, remember that example that said you're only going to show this element if the assigned to name is a manager. The right way to do that in InfoPath is to actually create a section around that. And then you can put logic on that section. So what we do to get you started with that is you can check a box that says I want to create sections around things like that. We don't actually migrate the formula for hiding the document. You'd have to go implement that manually, but we give you a good start by creating that section for you. You can also specify default control sizes. So Notes has this concept of controls that auto expand and grow. So as you type more lines, the control just keeps growing. InfoPath has a few controls that do that, but most controls don't do that. So you can, in our tool, you can specify if it's a auto expand field in Notes, what's the default size I want in InfoPath. And then finally, of course, you specify the column mappings, and we'll generate a default list of column mappings for you. It's almost always going to be right, but you can for advanced cases, you can kind of control the mappings and decide which fields you want to map and which ones you don't want to map. So when you run this form migration, there's a couple artifacts that come out of that. Of course, first is the new form template, and you would customize this as needed. And this is a good time to tell you that we don't do 100% of a form. We can't migrate everything that's on your notes form. So one is there are certain field types that are not going to map properly from notes over to SharePoint. So for example, if there's a button control on your form that maybe there's some code that pops up a dialog list, we're not going to be able to interpret that for you. So that's a case where you might want to go in as a developer and do something, whatever is appropriate, using your InfoPath development skills. Also, form events and things like that. There are cases where you want to go customize things, and sometimes just you can do things to clean up the look of the form a little bit. And I'll show you an example of that. But once you're ready, then you publish the form over to SharePoint right from InfoPath Designer. So this is the main thing that you get when you do a form migration. There's a couple other pieces which are more optional pieces for developers to use. One is we generated a form with developer markup. So this is a whole nother InfoPath form that's marked up with a lot of information for the developer, such as what were the formulas that we didn't migrate, what are the hidden fields that were here, and so on. And so the right way to use this form is to actually preview it in like fill out mode in InfoPath, and then you can hover over our icons and so on. And I'll show you what this looks like in just a few minutes. The migration report is another piece that comes out, and this is an HTML report file which shows you all the migrated and, more importantly, all the non-migrated elements that went into your InfoPath form. So this is a ton of detail here, but it's a really good tool for InfoPath developers to figure out what they need to go deal with. So you'll see we couldn't migrate this because we had this big input translation formula and so on. And so this is kind of your checklist for the developer to go finish the form off. And then finally, you can say I want debugging information created in a subfolder just on your desktop. And this is good if you have some problem and you need to send detailed log information to Quest. Why did my form come out the way I thought it would? You can just say I want to generate this debug information folder and just send that whole folder to Quest, zip it up and send it to Quest. So that's a useful piece for debugging purposes. Okay, now the other kind of target is generating InfoPath document forms. So it's the form library XML documents again, and this works for SharePoint 2007 and SharePoint 2010. So if you have SharePoint 2007, this is the only choice for InfoPath here. You can use our migration wizard again to create the InfoPath form, but this time you're starting from scratch. You don't have to migrate the list first, and you don't have to have a migration job even. You just run our form migration wizard, and we can migrate that from we generate an InfoPath form from scratch, right from the notes form, and then you open that form in InfoPath Designer, and from there you fix it up and then you publish it to SharePoint. InfoPath will either push this form out to an existing form library, or more often you can use it to provision a whole new form library. So again, the workflow is different. With a list form, you created the list first with a migration job, and then you kind of add a form to that after the fact. With this kind of form library, you actually create the form first and use InfoPath typically to publish the form library, and then you can create a migration job afterwards. So while you're using this migration wizard, there's a few extra things that you can do. You can say at what level of InfoPath form do I want? Do I want it to support form services or the full InfoPath client? So there's a few more things you can specify in terms of your schema mapping and field mapping. Here I want to distinguish between the design migration part and the content migration part. So let's say you went through this whole process and you provisioned this nice form library with our custom form in there. The migrating of content is going to be a separate step. So here's where you would now create a migration job to say, I want to generate a bunch of documents that fit in this form library. And so this is sort of a separate topic, and we're going to hold that topic until session 7, where we're going to be talking about XML document generation. And as you'll see when we get to session 7, our tool can generate XML documents to any schema, whether or not you created the form this way, or if you decided to just create your InfoPath form from scratch, it's the same thing. We can import that form into our migration job and do a nice generation of XML documents. So we'll hold off on that one. So let's switch over to we're going to take that list we just created and we're going to migrate this form from notes over to that SharePoint list. The first step is to go into the list settings and say, I want to customize the form. And you see this little InfoPath icon here. SharePoint will now generate an InfoPath form for us with the right schema. And here we go. So the schema of all the fields that read and write the SharePoint columns is right here. And we can see what's a choice field and so on. So you can, these 3 things that I came into a choice field, these are showing as choice fields here. Basically, it looks a heck of a lot like the default form that you had in SharePoint, basically one single column. But the point of this is now you can go take things and you can customize it and so on. So you can do all sorts of things. You could lay this out in tables, you could add icons and all that. And so basically that's the part we're going to automate for you, is slapping the notes design onto this form. So I've taken this form that SharePoint generated for me, and now I want to save this to the desktop. I'll just say save as, and I'll put it on my desktop. And let's call it report original.xsn. And then now I will close this InfoPath form. And very important here, do not publish this back to SharePoint yet because we're not ready. So say don't publish. And now we can flip over to our tool. And I can go Tools, Generate InfoPath Form Template. And in this case, I want to do a list form. And so these are the instructions for some of what I already did. I opened the list, I pressed the Customize Form button, and I saved it as a temporary copy to my disk. And now I can select that form, that template, the report orig.xsn, go on to the next step, and I select the notes form that I want to migrate over to this InfoPath form. So I'll pick the report form, and I'll put this form on my desktop as well. And I'll call this report new, just to keep the 2 reports separate. Next step. So here's the part where I get to select what fields I want, and I'm just going to take the defaults here. So do not migrate elements that are hidden in edit mode. So basically I want the things that are shown in edit mode, and basically the defaults are to take things that show in edit mode in the Notes client instead of the web browser. I do not want to migrate elements that are passed through HTML text on the form. I will migrate things that are hidden by a formula, but I will wrap those into sections. So create an info path section for elements that are hidden by a formula. So again, this is where a developer can come in later and replicate the hide when logic on that info path form in that section. And here's where I set my default control sizes. You're almost always just going to take the defaults here unless you really care about exactly how big the rich text field. You can always customize this later once you get the form. So usually I just take the defaults. And here's all my mappings. And we we inspected our migration job here. So again, remember that ID in Notes mapped over to the record ID in SharePoint. So if you did a good job in your migration job, you're not going to need to do anything here. You may see cases where there are fields on the Notes form that you did not map to SharePoint, and that would either come up like this, undetermined mapping, which means you have to fix it before you can hit the next button. So you can just say I do not want to map that at all, or I could say, I could manually control what I'm going to map to. But really, you're going to keep the defaults in most of the cases here. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and generate the detailed migration report in the developer markup version. Go next. And I have generated my form. I can see it just popped up on my desktop. So let's launch that form in design mode. And here you can see with my low screen resolution that we've got a nice looking form here. I'm going to just, for the convenience of this demo, I'm going to just tweak that down a little bit more. Whoops, that didn't look too good. Okay, that's a better size for SharePoint here. And I can fix up other things that I want. The spacing didn't come out perfectly here, so I'm just going to go ahead and delete that. You might come along and you might go ahead and set an input validation formula on one of these things. Keep it simple. I'll just take these defaults here. But the point is that we developed a nice form that looks like the Notes form. We've got the layout of things looking pretty good. We've got our fields in the right place, and the types of these fields are determined by the schema again, and that came out of the SharePoint list. So what matters here is that these were choice fields in the list schema, and so they come up as choice fields here. If I were to look at the properties of this choice field, we do have all the choices that we migrated in that first step over to the list schema. So now I like this, I can go ahead and save it off. So finally I can close this, and this time I will say save and publish back to SharePoint. So I don't have to re-migrate the data or run the migration job again. We basically just published this form that is attached to this button. So all I have to do is open a document and I should see the new form. And there we go. If I go into edit mode, I have everything I expect. This document didn't have much interesting in it, but maybe I can find a better one. Okay. I showed you migrating to the InfoPath list form. With the InfoPath form library, you can start from scratch. Well, let's do that from here. In the Notes Migrator for SharePoint console, I can select my database and I can say generate InfoPath form. So this is just another place you can do this. And here I want to migrate to a form library instead of to a list. Select the new file name. So let's call this report document form. And then again, I say which form do I want to migrate from. I'll go from the report form in Notes. So this wizard is a little different than before. And remember that I didn't have to create any SharePoint list or library yet. I don't have to have a migration job yet. I can just do this straight from the wizard right off the console. I also could get to this if I was in Designer. I could do this from Designer, but I want to show you I could do it from the console as well. So same options as to which controls I want and which size I want. For the mappings area, we actually have more controls here because before all the mappings were controlled by the migration job. Here the mappings could be direct straight from notes to this InfoPath form library. So you can also rename fields such as my public body. I want to rename that to public description and so on. And again, I have my defaults. Do I want the detailed migration report? Do I want the developer markup form? And I've created that form now, and I could launch the form template in design mode again. And it's the same idea here. I won't even bother to clean it up, but we've got a nice InfoPath form. And now I can make all the changes I want, and then I can publish it to SharePoint. So I would go File, Publish your form to the SharePoint server. And InfoPath is now going to walk me through publishing this. Select the SharePoint site. Do I want it to be a form library or a content type? I'll just use form library. And I'll make it a new form library instead of an existing one. And call this Proposion Development Tracking 2. And optionally, I can add some automatic mappings between this XML document and my list columns. So I'll just add one or two of these here. Let's map my subject field and map my project field. So these will just automatically show up in the view column, and they'll be synchronized between the XML document and the view column. And I can add as many as I want here. And that's it. Now I'm going to publish this to SharePoint. So InfoPath is doing the work here of taking this form template and publishing it to SharePoint. So let's go ahead and look at this form library in SharePoint. So we provision now a new form library in SharePoint. Just to show you how it works, let's create a new document. And sure enough, it's going to pop up the InfoPath form editor to edit that document. It would save this as an XML document. In session 7, we'll show you how to migrate content to an InfoPath form library. Well, we'll take the notes documents and be generating a bunch of the XML documents. So before I leave this feature completely, I also want to show you the other options here. I can launch it in design mode. I can also just fill it out as like a preview. More interesting is the detailed migration report. So this is that report that we generated for you that showed you all the stuff we did and all the stuff we didn't do in that InfoPath form. So for example, here's a control that we didn't migrate. It's up in the hidden area, and we said we didn't want to migrate hidden things, but you can see that it was not mapped to a schema entry because we didn't migrate it. But you can see what the original formula was. If I scroll down a little further, you can see things that were mapped. You know, the symptoms field, we migrated these labels. The status field had a default value formula that we didn't migrate. So this is really a good checklist for the developer to look at to figure out what they might want to do, or might want to ignore, but they should make a decision about what they want to do with these various pieces of the InfoPath form that didn't get migrated properly. That was the detailed migration report. The other piece that we give you is the developer markup template. This is really another version of the InfoPath form just for developers to use. And so this is highly decorated with comments, and we showed you, for example, all the hidden fields that were on the form design. And the best way to look at this is to go into preview mode. And so in preview mode, you can kind of hover over these little icons and you'll get a lot of information. This was hidden when reading and hidden when editing. This one has a default value formula This one has a default value formula. I'm looking for one that has input validation. Maybe I don't have any of those. But you get the idea that this developer markup version of the report, it's another view of the same information you get on your migration report, but it shows you kind of in the context where this stuff is. And another good tool if you're the developer who has to finish off this info path form. So now let's talk about migrating the views. So it's a new feature of version 6.1, and if you want to play with this, you can get in our beta program today, and we'll put you in to do some view migration. Now when we migrate views, we define views in the target data definition. It's on the Advanced tab. Or you can also get there using the Tools menu. You can go Tools, Migrate View. Either way, it gets to the same place. It's on the Advanced tab of the target data definition. And we have a view migration wizard that reproduces the notes views as closely as possible. Now, of course, the view technology is different in Notes than SharePoint. They're not the exact same thing, but we can get pretty close with most views. And so our wizard kind of gives you a side-by-side mapping of the Notes view information and the SharePoint information, and that allows you to kind of go through. We'll do as much as we can by default, but we'll also help you kind of make decisions along the way. And so once you're done running this wizard, this will provision the new view when you run the migration job. And so basically, every time you run a migration job, we'll provision any columns you need first, and you might be actually defining new columns as you do a view migration, as you'll see. And then we'll provision the views that use these columns, and so on. And we even have a checkbox that allows you to re-provision views. We'll actually just blow away the old view and re-provision it if you want to make changes and run this again. Now, for that side-by-side mapping of view elements in our wizard, this really goes down to column mapping. So we show you all the notes columns, and we'll try to match to the existing SharePoint columns as best we can, and we'll look at the mappings in your migration job. And if there's any columns missing, we'll recommend, hey, you referred to, the view refers to this column, but you forgot to map it, and we'll just add it automatically to your migration job. And for computed columns in Notes, we'll actually generate a calculated column in SharePoint. Now, we don't have a auto translator for the formula yet. We may get that in a future release, but we give you a nice formula editor where you can kind of look side by side the Notes formula and try to reproduce a SharePoint formula. So we don't do everything for you, but we think this is a huge step forward for doing view migration. Similarly, the grouping and sorting choices will show you the Notes versus SharePoint things. And now in SharePoint, there is one important limitation you need to know about. You only have 2 levels of grouping and 2 levels of sorting. So there's nothing we can do about that really. So we'll show you the first 2, but you might want to make another decision and pick a different column to sort by, knowing that you only get 2 of them. With the totals, we're in good shape there with the total section. So in Notes, you have options. You can say, I want to do subtotaling on these columns, or I want to count, display a count, or I want to do an average or something like that. So most of the common totaling options in Notes are also supported in SharePoint. So we can map those pretty clearly and simply. The filtering, not so good there. With the filtering, we're switching over from a selection formula in Notes over to more of a checkbox. I want to filter on these columns with these values. So it's much more limited in SharePoint what you can do with filtering. You have to manually convert the selection formula over to the definition of filtering the way SharePoint likes to see it. Okay, back over to demos, and let's do a view migration. So I'm going to go back to that same migration job now, and I'm going to go back to my target data definition, edit that, and go to the Advanced tab. And this is where we define views. Now, like I said, you can also get there by just doing Tools, Migrate Views, and we'll just go to that same spot. So I could define a view from scratch right here by pressing the New button. That's not really as interesting as migrating it from Notes, so let's do that. I'm going to import a view from Notes. And first thing I do is I select the view that I'm going to migrate. And again, this view migration, by the way, is part of our beta, and we know we're still working on the UI, so we'll expect to see this continue to change in the UI, but the basic functionality is going to be what I'm showing you now. So let's pick a view that I want to migrate. So let's go reports by target and migrate that main view. I can decide what I want to call this in SharePoint. Now in Notes, this slash, it means it will display these views with a hierarchy. You don't have that in SharePoint by default. All reports by project. I think that'll look nicer in SharePoint. Because this was the default view in Notes, we're going to make this a default view in SharePoint. And I want an attachment column on here. And let's also throw in these other columns. So these are the standard SharePoint columns that you might see for edit. So it displays this little icon where you can edit things, or the document icon, document type icon. And so I'll just even though these weren't in the notes view, I'm going to just check these to show you what they look like. And so now I have all my columns. And like I said, we've done our best to map these columns. So this first column was a categorized column. It was untitled in Notes, but it was reading the project field. So we could map that to the project column in SharePoint. The type field again maps to record type, because remember we made that change. Same with area. Now this one was a computed field, so we're not currently parsing the computed field, so you the migration guy has to make some decisions. So I can look at this and I can see it's pulling out the common name format of the assigned to field. That's a notes thing, just formatting the name. So in SharePoint, I'm not going to worry about formatting so much. I can just use an existing column, and I'll just use the assigned to column, because SharePoint will automatically display the assigned to column properly. So I'm not going to worry about the display, and I'll just pick the existing column. So that's all I need to do. I need to make those changes, and now I've got a good view definition for all my columns. Next is grouping and sorting. We're grouping on that first one, so now we're going to be grouping in SharePoint on the project field with the ascending sort. In Notes, we were sorting by the type and status field, so we're going to sort by record and status field. So usually we have pretty good defaults, and then we didn't have any totaling occurred. If we did, it would have come up with something like count for a text field. If it was a numeric field, you would have more options like average or total or things like that. And then for the view selection formula, this view was just selecting things created with the report form. Well, remember, I already migrated only those things that were created with a report form to this list, so I'm just going to take everything. I'm not going to put a filter on this SharePoint list. I'm going to just save this. And so now I have one view definition in this target data definition. So I'm going to do another one. This one's going to be a little bit more complicated. I'm going to select the Portal Migrator Task Planning view. And just to show you what this looks like in Notes, let's press that Open in Notes button. So this one is categorizing by this computed field, which puts together the status field with the version number in some cases. And it's only showing things that apply to this one product, Portal Migrator. Also notice this one has some icons which display the priority as little icons. I'll just keep the name Migrator Task Planning, and I won't put these extra icons, the edit and document type icon, on there. And now this is when it's more interesting. We have a big computed field here, and so if you know how to read notes formulas, you can see that basically unless it was closed, it's going to display either the status or the status followed by the version, depending on whether there is a version specified, or if it is closed, it's going to display closed and fixed in whatever the version number is. So now I need to migrate this to SharePoint. So I'm just going to copy this to the clipboard here, and I'm going to pop up my column editor. So for a computed column in SharePoint, I can use this editor to kind of quickly develop a field. So I might do things like insert a code fragment. So here's a bunch of predefined SharePoint formulas which will really help you get started. For example, if I'm looking for text manipulation formula, just go here and here's a formula to change text to uppercase. So let's select that one. And so we've populated this formula for you and automatically highlighted the first column you need to deal with. And I can do insert field and pick one of the fields in my list, such as the computer name. And so now we've generated a perfectly good formula. If I wanted to validate this on SharePoint, just press the validate button. And we actually go to SharePoint, this SharePoint list, and do a validation. And if I had an error, you would see a warning message here. So here's the validation formula passed. Whereas if I put in something like, so let's validate this one, and we got an error. Syntax is not correct or not supported. So we don't give you a lot of detail, but it gives you the same thing you'd get if you were to go into SharePoint and just try to enter this column formula yourself. I'm going to just delete that and paste in that notes formula here. We can look at this formula right here. And so this is actually a formula that you can translate perfectly to SharePoint if you know how to do it. So I can say if, instead of @if, you're using the if function. And the same with this one. And instead of not equals, you want to use greater than or less than signs. For the if function, you don't use semicolons, you use commas. And instead of the uppercase function, you do upper, the upper macro. These SharePoint formulas, by the way, are basically based on Microsoft Excel formulas. So if you know how to do Excel formulas, you're in good shape here. Another difference is string concatenation. You don't use the plus sign, you use an ampersand for string concatenation. And there's one more here. And then the other thing is, in notes you have this concept of an if statement can have this condition gets this value, this condition gets this value, and then you have the final choice here. You actually have to nest these as another if statement. So you can't just do multiple chaining of conditions. You'd have to chain this one. And I think it goes like this. Let's just see how I did. I probably messed up something because I usually do. Oh, I got it right. Good. So let's see how that works out. Now, what I just did required some knowledge for sure. You need to understand certainly how SharePoint formulas work. Hopefully, our helper code, insert field, insert code fragment will help you. We also have a link to the SharePoint help on the SharePoint formulas. So it's a more extensive document. They have a lot of samples in there as well as descriptive stuff. Some of our samples we stole from this page, but we also have additional samples that were not on this page because we found that this documentation isn't extensive. It doesn't quite cover everything we would want to cover. So we added some other examples in our insert code fragment that would cover a lot of more common notes cases here. So hopefully that will be helpful to you. So I've defined this computed column. I need to give it a name. Let's call it assign status. One of the things with computed columns in SharePoint is you have to give it a unique name. So I can't just call it status again because status is already taken. I guess I kind of got lucky here because I didn't rename any of these. I forgot to mention that if I had a name that wasn't a good SharePoint name, I can use square brackets in here. So, for example, if I changed my name to something else, I could just do insert field and then find that name here. But in this case, I got lucky because all the names were simple, so they didn't require square brackets, and I had used the exact same names. But if you're renaming things, make sure you're using the new SharePoint display names here. Well, it's probably always a good idea to use the square brackets for the names just to avoid any confusion, because especially if you're not very familiar with how the syntax works, it's probably a good idea to use these bracket names. And again, you're referencing the SharePoint names. Okay. So you might think, couldn't the machine have done this? And yes, we will be working, not in 6.1, but in future releases, on a nice formula translator for you. But again, we think we've done a lot to help you so far. So this next column is this is the column that displayed those icons. You can see it's an icon column here. And so they had a formula that computed the icon. So 151 happens to be that little one icon with a circle around it. Well, we don't have icon formulas in SharePoint. So what do I want to replace this with in SharePoint? I might just eliminate it completely. I could say do not use and we'll just eliminate it. Or I might say I want to use an existing column, so maybe I should just display the priority here, and that's in fact what I'll do. Are there any others? Here's another, that name assigned to. We're just going to display the assigned to field. And same with the entered by field. There was an entered by field which was the common name of the first part of the author field. Well, we don't do name formatting in SharePoint very much, so I'm just going to take the author field. This first column here is my categorized field. Well, I'm going to be creating this this computed field here called assign status, but I don't necessarily need to display it as a column in my view. That's going to be the field I'm using for grouping. So I'm actually going to take this to say migrated but not displayed. So even though I'm migrating this, I'm not displaying it as a column in the view. I can still use it now for grouping. It's still, we remembered that this categories field on Title 1 was replaced with the assign status field, so we're going to use it in our grouping. And the same with the sorting here. Here's a case where we had 4 levels of sorting, but we can only have 2 in SharePoint. And if I wanted to, I could change what I want to prioritize. I could say, instead of record type, I really want to focus in on the area here. So you can make those changes. And we also have a selection formula. So the selection formula is saying it's got to be, the original form was report, and they're all like that in this case. So I won't worry about that one. The project equals portal migrator. So I'm going to copy that to the clipboard and turn on my view filter editor. And so this looks a lot like when you're designing view filters in SharePoint. You have to say, I pick the field, project is equal to, and I'll just paste that in. And the status field is not closed fixed or closed no plan to fix or rejected. So I have to do this a little differently. I don't have an isMember function, but I can do show more columns. And this is an and. The status field is not equal to closed fixed, and the status field is not equal to closed no plan to fix. And one more, the status field is not equal to rejected. So now we have two. If I want to go edit these, by the way, again, we don't go through the Notes Migration Wizard. This is just the raw editor of the SharePoint view, and it basically just mirrors everything you have in SharePoint. So you can make some tweak here, but it's basically the things that you have in SharePoint. There's a few extra fields that are just SharePoint specific. They have nothing to do with Notes Migration, but these are things you can configure in SharePoint, like the number of items you want to display, and so on. Standard SharePoint options that we just exposed for you here. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this migration job again. I really don't need to remigrate the content, so I will just do provision only. So I'm going to run the provision only parts of this migration job. And let's go back to our list again. If I click on our list, hopefully our default view is changed over to that all reports by project view, and sure enough it did. And so we're grouping by project, and I can go into Portal Migrator, and then within that we should have the right sorts. Now in this view, remember I said I wanted to add the document icon and the edit menu. I got the other view columns all here. So these are all simple columns. And then if I switch over to my Portal Migrator task planning, I should see just the Portal Migrator ones because that filter that I added. And I'm sorting by this computed column. That's the status followed by the version number, or the status without a version number if there isn't one. And we have all these columns here. And remember we said we are going to sort by priority. Oh, finally, here's one with an attachment. I was looking for one of those. So this is just showing off the rich text part of our bug report. Okay, so that's the view migration process. Okay, now the last big area we want to talk about today is provisioning of content types. So like I said, provisioning of content types is very similar to provisioning a schema in a list. In order to do that, you're going to be using the migration console, and this is one of those things you can't do just in Designer. So I'm going to start at the migration console, and we have a bunch of different wizards which you can use to generate a content type. So we actually give you a few nice choices. You can start from a notes form to generate a content type. So similar to migrating the schema of a notes form, you can just start from a notes form from scratch and generate a new content type with all those same fields. We also give you some other options which are really good, just general SharePoint development things. These are things you can't do in SharePoint, but if you've ever done SharePoint development, you probably wish you could take an existing SharePoint list and create a content type from it. Using our tool, you can. So that's a powerful feature. Also, if you've already designed a migration job, you can use that to generate a content type. So whichever way you load this, you kind of create a starter content type definition, and then you can continue to add and remove columns as you see fit. And you can also set the content type title, what content type group it's in, and the parent content type. So when we provision these content types, we provision them over to the site level. So content types always live in a site collection, a parent site collection site, or a subsite. And then, as you probably know, content types kind of apply automatically to any subsites that you create. So you could create a content type at a parent site level, and you could use them in all the subsites. So we provide ways to provision this on demand. You can just press a button to say I want to provision my content type, or we can do this as part of that big migrate to SharePoint action, so in one big sequence you can generate sites, you can provision the content types and the security, and then run the migration jobs all in one big batch. Now, one important thing about content types is content types are made up of site columns. And this is a standard SharePoint thing. So when we provision the content types, we're also provisioning site columns along the way. So site columns. This says shared columns. That's a typo. It means I meant site columns. So when we provision a content type, we'll actually try to find a site column that we can use if one already exists. So say you wanted a column called customer name and you want it to be a text field, we'll go look to see if there's already a site column called customer name and make sure it's the right type with the right options, and then we'll use that to provision our content type. If we didn't find one, then we'll create a new site column that would have those same properties. So this kind of covers the content type provisioning feature. Also, just as a reminder, and we already looked at this in a previous session, you can add content types to your migration jobs, and that would push the content type into a list. So really, the provisioning task is to generate a content type on a site, and then the migration task is to add it to a list as you're generating a list or migrating to it. So let's take a look at this with our last set of demos here. So here's that same database that I was working with in the migration console. And if I open the database properties, we have a new tab called Content Types. Now, before I forget, I should mention that you can also define content types in your technical classes as well. So if you wanted to define this content type to work for all my applications of a certain type, then you define it at the class level instead of the individual database level. But for simplicity, I'll just do this at the individual database level. If I wanted to, I could define a new content type from scratch, but I prefer to use one of these wizards. So let's migrate this from a notes form. So I want to migrate this from the report notes form. And then just like I was when I was creating my data definitions, I get prompted for what fields do I want to include. And I'll again include all the fields in the report form in my content type. And so I have now a content type definition that I've generated. And I can specify the target site where I want to push this content type to. And I can specify the name of this. We'll just call it Dev Tracking Report. And I'll put it in my, by default, the custom content types group. And my parent content type, content types are hierarchical, so one content type can kind of subclass another content type. But in this case, I'll just derive from item. But if I had some other content type that I wanted to derive from, I could easily select that here. And then I'm going to associate it with the report form. And in my site columns, here's all the columns that I picked. And again, I can do that same kind of job of cleaning this up, rearranging this, saying this one is renamed, and this one's a choice field, and so on. So I won't go through all that again, but you get the idea that you can clean up your content type definition just as much as you would a custom list. And I can add new columns and so on. So now I have my content type definition here. I'm actually going to add another one. This time I'm going to import from an existing list. So let's pick that list that I already created. So I'm going to browse my SharePoint site, and let's take that list I created, and let's just call this Dev Tracking Report 2. And again, I'll take all these defaults here, but all these fields have been copied in from the list that I already created. So I already defined record ID and record type. I've already carefully laid this out. Sometimes it's going to be very convenient to do all my development work in a custom list and then convert that to a content type later. So again, this is actually pretty useful even if you're not doing notes migration work. A lot of SharePoint developers wish they had this, where they could take an existing list and convert it to a content type. Okay, I'm missing something here. Oh, I got to select my site. By the way, the reason this use current target site is grayed out is because I didn't specify a current site in my migration targets tab. If I had specified in my migration target tab, I could just say use the current site, and then that would be reusable as I provision other sites and things like that. Okay, so now we have two content types. So I'm just going to provision one of these. Let's provision this Dev Tracking Report. Just select it and press provision. And so it's going to kick off a provisioning content type task. And it's connecting to SharePoint, going to that target, and provisioning that list. So we got one warning here about warning me that the body field, found an existing site column called body, but it wasn't an enhanced HTML field. So you'll see lots of warnings and all that. If I look into my log details, I could actually go into much more details about which fields. Actually, I don't have verbose logging turned on, but if I did have verbose logging turned on, I could see which site columns we found existing ones for and which site columns we provisioned new ones for. So let's go to that content type in SharePoint. So here's my content type definition, and it's called Dev Tracking Report, and we have all these columns. And I could customize this further now in SharePoint. I could turn on some advanced settings like, do I want to um, make this content type read only, and standard SharePoint things. Okay, so that's the generation of content types. I will also show you that if I go into my site settings and look at my site columns list, if I go into that group of custom columns, I can see that we've basically generated these columns assigned to, etc. Some of these came from other projects, but you can see a lot of these columns we generated version fix we generated for use with this one content type. If I were to provision another content type that used the same column name with the same type, we would just reuse this site column in that other content type as well. And just to show you this content type is doing what we're supposed to be doing, let's go create a new list. And I'll just make this a custom list. And so if I go into my list settings in SharePoint, I can go my advanced settings and enable the use of content types, yes. And I can say add from the existing site content types, and hopefully I have my Dev Tracking Report in here. I can add that to my list. And sure enough, it automatically added all these columns that are using that content type. So now I've created a content type which is reusable in multiple lists. If I went into a migration job and I want to do this automatically, let's create a new job real quickly here. No, I don't want to save that. If I go into my, let's skip that part. Just select the SharePoint site, test list 2, and when I create my target data definition, I can say I want to allow management of content types, same idea, and I can specify one of my site content types, dev tracking. You associate the dev tracking report with report, and then that means when I provision this list, I will push the dev tracking report content type into the list, just like I showed you I did manually. And then when I do the migration, I'm automatically going to take every document that has the form that came from the report form and will assign the content type dev tracking to this. On the data fields tab, I can say I want to load this from the content type. So the list doesn't exist yet, so I can't load it from the list, but I can load it from the content type. And so all the fields in the content type are here. Okay, so now I go to my auto map tab, auto map all those fields, and run the job. So it's going to provision that list, push the content type in, and then assign the content type to the records. And so you can see we migrated the documents, we assigned it to the dev tracking report content type. So that wraps up our session. I wanted to point you to one other resource which you might find very interesting. We talked a little bit about switching over from the code-based world in Notes over to a declarative world using SharePoint InfoPath. And we actually recently recorded a different webcast, not part of this series. It was a webcast that was done with Microsoft. Microsoft engineer Ira Fuchs is an author and written some books, and in particular he wrote a book called Enterprise Application Development in SharePoint 2010, Creating End-to-End Applications Without Code. And Ira's thing is to really explain to the world how much you can do now with declarative development. Instead of writing code, you're using Workflow Designer or an InfoPath Designer and so on to do a lot of enterprise class applications. And so this is a very nice book with some cool samples in there. So if you're interested, I would suggest going to this URL and viewing the webcast that I recorded with Ira. And also, if you want to get your own copy of this book, here's a discount code you can use. Go to this website, and then you can get a discount on this book. So, final reminder, you can join our beta program if you wish, and here's the link for that. I appreciate everyone's attending this class, and join you next week for some of our tools and tips migration session.